welcome everybody. Welcome to Review It Yourself, enthusiastic as ever. Today I've got a guest with me, Arron from the Time To Talk Titanic podcast. Why did I find that difficult to say? And we're going to be reviewing Titanic, the 1953 film. So I'll throw over to Arron. Welcome, Arron. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's the first time I've actually been approached by another podcaster to feature on their show. I have a lot of people reaching out that want to appear on my podcast, but this is the first time I've had someone reach out and say, hey, do you want to come on and discuss it? So yeah, really cool and interesting as well that it's not strictly a Titanic podcast that reached out. You know, it's a film review podcast. So I like that. So thanks very much for having me.
It's absolutely fine. There's a bit of an excuse. I've said this before when I reviewed a documentary with LA Beatles. She does a Titanic podcast over in the States, and she said the same. And I said, well, if you look back through, and admittedly there are a lot of them, if you look back through my episodes, there's like Titanic all the way through. So it was a toss-up really between doing a Titanic podcast and doing a film podcast. And the thing that swung it for me in the end was that I kind of looked and thought, well, there's enough Titanic podcasts out there. I don't know how I'd bring anything new to the table. It's easier to just talk about a film. But no, it's interesting that you talk about people approaching you to be on yours. Like for me, I've always approached people to ask them to guest on mine. And then if they want to ask me on theirs, then that's up to them. So that's an interesting way to go about it. It's a bit kind of, I wouldn't have thought that was a way to do it. Like, excuse me, can I come on yours? No, like, who are you again? So
I've even had people reach out and ask to be co-hosts, and recently I'm actively looking for like a pool of co-hosts now. So I'm actually looking to have almost like a panel. So I'd say up to maybe 10 plus myself. That it kind of changes, you know, each time we record. So, you know, we'll never be the same few people. It might just be myself sometimes. But before I was looking for that, I would have people message me and be like, hey, can I be your co-host? And I'd be like, I don't know you. Sure, but we might have no chemistry at all, and then it would be rubbish. So, but yeah, it's interesting when you say, you know, what do I bring to the table that's different? And I kind of had a bit of that because I started the podcast and I started it with my friend Louis, who was my original co-host, and he's still part of the team, but it's not like a strict kind of two-man show anymore. It's kind of this, you know, entity that's grown a little bit. But there was a period where I kind of stopped because I think I had a little bit of like imposter syndrome, because I was like, you know, I was like, what am I bringing to the table? Like, what am I doing that's different? But then actually I thought, well, it's fun. I enjoy it. So even if I'm not bringing anything new, I'm having fun. But actually, I think for a lot of people that talk about Titanic and have like platforms, it's about keeping the story, not just keeping it alive, but keeping the truth and like the actual facts at the forefront, because there's a lot of kind of myths and misunderstandings around it. So I kind of view it now as I'm keeping its legacy alive in my own little way. And I'm also pushing the truth of the disaster and kind of, you know, putting to bed any misunderstandings that there are.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. I mean, you might not feel like you bring anything new, but you're bringing you. Like, that's the whole thing about, it's like podcasts. People will listen to you or they won't listen to you. And that goes for me and yourself and anyone who does one. You've kind of got to do it for yourself first and then just enjoy it, I think. But no, it's a point you bring up. I know some people do a lot of kind of the political side of Titanic and apply it to now. And I kind of get that. But for me, it was, I don't know where I'd go with it. So I just kind of left it to the side and thought, well, I'll come back to that later. But
see, now you have the best of both worlds now, because like you say, you can kind of dip your toe in that Titanic pool whenever you want. And, you know, you can, in discussing the film, you know, tonight, we can go into all sorts. So, you know, one episode you're doing can be about any film that's obviously nothing to do with Titanic. But then whenever you want, I mean, there's so many documentaries, there's multiple TV series of Titanic. So you do kind of have the best of both, where you can still venture into the Titanic sphere, but you're not constricted to it.
Yeah, oh, it was an absolute cheat. It was to do films was an absolute kind of, I'll do this. And then I kept it vague enough in the title and vague enough in what I said I'd do. Like, it originally started off 4 and a bit months ago as just films. Then I started doing TV. Then I started doing documentaries. Then I started, my friend's writing a book and said, can I come and talk about that? So I was like, yeah, of course you can. I'll just create a side series. I just add bits to it. And just, you see what works and if it kind of lands on it.
Exactly.
So so we're here to talk about Titanic, the 1953 film. I did really like the introduction to this one because I haven't seen it in quite a while, and I mean like years, since I was a kid probably. The opening with kind of the iceberg and this ominous music, this proper old-fashioned sweeping music, was like, oh, that's an interesting way to start. They don't usually start like that. They tend to start with either the launch or the sailing maiden voyage day. They don't tend to start with kind of this ominous, an iceberg breaks off and kind of floats into the sea. I thought that was an interesting way to do it.
Yeah, I liked that actually. It was because, like yourself, I first saw it when I was really young, and I feel like the website I watched on is probably like banned now. You know, the quality was awful. It was probably like upside down in certain parts. So watching it today was like a total treat because I was actually paying attention, and it was like good quality. But yeah, the start of it is quite ominous actually. And I wish I could remember where I either read or heard this, but I think it was maybe the voiceover of a documentary about the Titanic. And it was saying that at the same time that the Titanic was, being built or, being born, the iceberg was kind of also coming to life. And, their journeys almost, judging by the size of the iceberg, its location, people have actually theorized that it would have broke away at about the same time that the Titanic started being built. And so they happen to just kind of begin at the same time and meet in the same place, which as a concept is really creepy because one is purely natural and one is man-made, but they both, started at the same time, they both came into, and this horrific incident happened. So to start the film with this, like you say, this ominous iceberg rising out of the ocean was actually like a really quite abstract and ominous choice that, I liked it a lot. It was really cool.
Yeah, it was just such a unique way, and I'd forgotten that's what it was like. And I thought, this is and the music as well, like really, swelled up, and I thought, oh, this is quite clever. And then they have a really clever way to introduce the characters, a lot of which we don't see because it's very historical for the most part. It kind of just follows a family. And you've got the people going through, and I know people have said it's not massively historically accurate, especially if you're into Titanic like we are. We'll probably pick bits out of it. But, they're reading out things like, oh, this is a gift for the Guggenheims, this is a gift for the Astors, this is a gift. And I was like, oh, that's quite a good way of doing it. And then we meet. Yeah. No, so sorry, go on.
No, I was just totally agreeing. Just when you're saying that, it was something I picked up on that they mentioned Archibald Butt, and we do see we see the Astors and we see the Strausses, so it is actually a clever way of acknowledging the people that were on the ship. But it's interesting that they also do away with certain people. So you don't have Bruce Ismay, you don't have Thomas Andrews, which it's interesting. So it's interesting that they acknowledge people that were on the ship, but then they also completely erase others who were on the ship. It's strange.
I quite like that, to be fair. I quite like the fact that, unlike many other Titanic films, including the 97 one, the characters are there, but the story's not beholden to them. Like, this is probably the only Titanic film I've seen, series or anything like that, that's reenacted it. That you don't have like the characters bumping into people, and they don't, like the Astors, and they're there, the Strausses are there, but they don't become a massive part of it. It really is just on one story. I know that was a criticism of kind of the 97 Titanic, that, well, why do you get this fictional characters? And I know this is the same, they're both fictional, this family, but they bounce off the historical characters, and people kind of didn't like that very much. Whereas this film, it's just like they're there because they're the passengers, but we're not really having anything to do with them. And obviously it's British, so it sets up the class system really, really early on. You see the maids, and you see the the masters, if you will. You see the first class passengers, then you see the crew. So it's quite interesting the way they introduce all these characters together.
It's you, what you're saying spot on, that these true historical characters that were really there, they're not totally integral to the story. The main point is Barbara Stanwyck's character, Clifton Webb's character, they are the focal point. And I actually wrote in my notes at one point, I said, why was JJ Astor even in this film? Was it just so that he could give Richard a suit? Because it kind of seems like that's the only reason that he was even in it, because Richard bumps into him, was like, "Oh, JJ, can I go into your room and get a suit?" And JJ's like, "Sure, you do you." And you go, and that's it. And then you briefly see him getting Madeline onto a lifeboat, and that's it. Like, so, and then even the Strouses, they're mentioned and they're in it a couple of times actually, but they didn't need to be. They just kind of were, because I think actually the Strouses might be the only characters that are in every single iteration of the retelling the story, because the image of the elderly couple refusing to part has just become so entangled in the legend. So doing away with Esme and Thomas Andrews is one thing, but it's like, God forbid that we did away with the Strouses. Like, we can't do that.
No, definitely not. Although, to be fair, not to dampen the mood down, but for people who aren't, you'll understand why I've said that in a minute. But I'm trying not to be funny about it, but I'm trying to be serious there. So it's Isidore and Isaac Strauss. So they were the owners of Macy's, the department store in New York. And I think the only iteration that they aren't in is the 1943 Titanic, but that was done by the Nazi Party. And I think, if I'm right in remembering, the Jewish heritage, so clearly they wouldn't have been in it. Although that story does have Jewish characters in it, but it's kind of all evil and it's all to do with their insane logic and that kind of. Anyway, not to depress it down.
And it's on YouTube for anyone that wants to watch it, and whoever uploaded it has literally called it Nazi Titanic, so it's easy to find, and you won't be looking for long. But
you probably won't watch it for long.
Oh God, I know it's a lot. Ismay in that version is heavily coded as being Jewish, which in real life he wasn't. But Ismay in it, you're watching it and it's disgusting, because he's just every awful caricature of a Jewish person that the Nazis could think of, they just put onto the character of Ismay. But it just shows, all these different versions. There's all these different ways of retelling it. But with this, the 1953 version, what I thought was really interesting, so we've kind of spoken about, briefly the kind of historical characters, fictional characters. I'm assuming anyone listening to this has either seen the film or wants to see the film, and I would recommend watching it. But in terms of the set design, I find it really interesting, because the film came out 41 years after the sinking. And so RMS Olympic, who was like Titanic's nearly identical sister ship, had only been out of service for like a few years at this point. But for some reason, the sets look nothing like Titanic or Olympic, which is fine, but they actually look more like the Mauretania or the Lusitania, which were the two ships that came kind of before the Olympic class. And they were very big, they were very fast, they were like super luxurious. And for instance, the dining rooms on the Lusitania and the Mauretania were like 2 or 3 stories high. They were huge. Like the dining rooms, they were like marble and gold, and they had balconies and like multiple staircases and skylights and domes. They were stunning. And people who were able to tour the Olympic when the Olympic, was launched, criticized it, because the dining rooms there were like 1 story, like they're just like normal rooms. And okay, they were beautiful, but they were seen as kind of underwhelming, because they were like, we've already got the Lusitania, which is like a palace, and then you've got this, But the reason for that was the White Star Line kind of wanted to emphasize technological advancement over, the look of the ship. So, I mean, the ship was stunning, but, the Lusitania were drawing from like palaces and foreign lands when it came to the decor. But the White Star Line really wanted to kind of emphasize on Britishness, and they wanted passengers to come on and feel like they were in a manor house or, a townhouse in London. The dining room on the Titanic, the first class dining room, was inspired by the Ritz in London. And the reason that it didn't have to be multiple stories was because on the Lusitania, there was no air conditioning. So the boilers below would make the ship really, really, really hot, but the hot air would rise to the tops of these really big rooms. So people sitting having dinner wouldn't be like burning alive. But on the Titanic, they had air conditioning. So the White Star Line was like, we don't need big tall rooms because we've got fancy modern air conditioning. So it was interesting watching this film and seeing these really, really, really tall rooms. And I'm like, you could be on the Lusitania. It's pretty convincing. And like I say, it'd only been 40 odd years. So there'd be people who had been on the Titanic or the Olympic would be sitting watching this going, that doesn't look like Titanic.
I think I've got an explanation that weaves through what you've said absolutely. In that it was about, for the White Star Line, it was about cost. So they went for single story rooms because it was the cost. Also, the difference between the White Star ships and the Cunard ships is that the Cunard ships, all their funnels worked as far as I'm aware, whereas the Titanic's fourth one didn't. That's what they used for air conditioning, which is why the Titanic has so few of those, and I've forgotten the name of them. The air intakes, they've got so few of those on the deck compared to like the Aquitania that came a little bit later, but it was very similar. And it was about cost for them, I think, to try and keep the costs down. And to be fair, if anything, from a purely shipbuilding point of view, the Olympic Starliners, the Titanic, the Olympic Titanic, Britannic, they were, if anything, just old technology, especially in terms of the rudders and the way they were put together. They were very old-fashioned, whereas the Lusitania and Mauretania were very streamlined. They were quick. They were going for that blue ribbon speed record, which is another myth. People say, oh, they lit the boilers on the Titanic to get it to go faster a bit. They were never going to break the record. It's like, think about it like this. So you've got like these, for like the layperson, the Cunard liners were like thoroughbreds, slim, fast, built for speed, but still luxurious, still lovely to look at. Whereas the Titanic, the Olympic class, were very much like, beautiful, but like a big shy horse. They were beautiful, they did the job, but they were much bigger. They weren't as quick. So that was, and also, but I do think this is where a film comes into it, in that because back then, the more luxurious parts of the Titanic that we think about, such as the grand staircase, would not have been possible to build to look anywhere near as good, until you get 1997 technology. Let's CGI it now. Whereas, so I think what they did was they were like, right, well, we'll just make these big rooms. We'll have to just make these big double-story rooms that people would expect to be on a ship like that. Whereas people like us who've read about it and looked at pictures go, yeah, that wasn't on it. But yeah, but it's still enjoyable. But no, I picked up that as well. I was like,
totally. And it's really funny how tastes change, because even on the film poster, it's the Queen Mary, So the first thing people would have seen in 1953 is the Queen Mary, and then they go into the cinema, and the model they use is really good. I think it's a fantastic model that they use for the day shots where it's sailing and there's smoke coming out the funnels, the sinking shots. Just in general, the visual effects are fantastic. I think they really hold up well. So it's just funny that they really put all this attention to detail for the model. But then on the poster, they were like, we'll just slap on the Queen Mary. It'll be fine. No one will notice. And it's like, well, okay, that's a choice. But tastes really do change, because, the Titanic and the Olympic were stunning. They were beautiful. The grand staircase is just gorgeous. But in terms of kind of the taste that people had in the 40s and 50s, they would have been looking for things like they see in this film. They'd look at the rooms in this film and go, wow, that's amazing. Whereas if they'd actually built accurate sets, people in the 50s would have been like, is that what the Titanic looks like? It's a bit boring. It's a bit small, a bit cramped. So yeah, I can totally see why they did that. I just thought it was really funny. And there's one film in particular which came out before this. It might actually be quote unquote Nazi Titanic. I'm not sure. Where there's like this ballroom and it's like 4 stories tall. It's huge. So at least this film dialed it down a little bit.
Yeah, and also, maybe they wanted to be more filmic, more cinematic. And also, I think if you remember what the world was like, in the late 40s, the early 50s, Britain was still in rationing from the war. There was a lot of hardship across Europe. America was America were kind of still recovering as well. So I think, if anything, the people probably wanted to see something grand. They didn't want to see something that was kind of, I always think about, if it's like they keep talking about, they're making this Titanic theme thing in China, and they keep talking about making a second Titanic. Well, the issue would be if you made one that actually sailed, because I know they're building the one in China, but if you built one that actually sailed, once it went past a normal sized tanker or went past a passenger ship, you'd be like, that's really small. Like it would not, I wouldn't want to see one personally, because I think it would like ruin it. I think I'd see it and be like, is that it? Especially like the Costa Concordia disaster when that sank, capsized, and because I remember I was at work when that was in the news, and people were like, I don't know if it was the same for you, Aaron. People were like, "Oh, you like ships? I mean, it's not as big as the Titanic, though, is it?" And I was like, "Yes, no, it's not. It's like 100 foot longer and a bit more and a lot higher." And people were like, "Is it really? I thought the Titanic was huge." I was like, "Well, it was for the day, but for today, like 100 odd years later, it would be a bit like, oh, look at the little ship, isn't it? Not to do it down, but it would kind of fail against your expectations. So maybe that's where they were going. I don't know. That's just my idea.
Completely. Yeah. In terms of the characters, so we've got Julia, who's played by Barbara Stanwyck. We've got Richard, who is played by Clifton Webb.
Mm-hmm.
Norman, don't know the actor's name, but in terms of the daughter, is her name Annette?
Yes, Annette. Yeah, it is. Yeah. She's good. I liked her.
I like her. Yeah. But
no, God, what do you mean? What do you really think? Go on.
Her mum basically like kind of sums up how I feel, and I feel like Annette's a bit of a lost cause and a bit pointless, and there's no point even trying anymore.
I've got a quote. I've written. She's an arrogant little prig. That's the mother talking about her child. Because if anyone who hasn't seen this, like Annette's like, she's nearly 18. She's like 17, nearly 18. So the upshot is we meet Mr. Richard Sturgis, Clifton Webb, and Mrs. Sturgis, Julia Sturgis, is it? And they're estranged. He's English, she's American. Does it sound familiar? It should do. For a Titanic film. They've got like 2 kids, or we think they've got 2 kids, but more on that later. So we've got 17, nearly 18-year-old Annette, very kind of like her dad, very prim and proper, and exactly what you'd expect of a woman or a lady of that age, that era. Edwardian people, not Victorian, and not the other people. Always get it confused. Anyway, it's a bugbear of mine, isn't it? Anyway, so she's like a lost. The mother's like, I want to take them back to America. I want to take them back to their roots. They're too highly strung. I don't want to have to do with it. Like, she's a lost cause, but Norman isn't. Norman's 10. I think they don't mention it, but apparently IMDb is 10.
Yeah, apparently he's 10. And I really like with Norman, his obsession with, the first line he has is he really wants to see the Marconi aerials on the Titanic as they're approaching on the tender. And he mentions it a couple of times, he's really fascinated with the Marconi equipment. And it's a little thing, but in terms of a character kind of thing, it's good, because a 10-year-old boy nowadays might be obsessed with the latest, gadgets, or, the next iPhone, what kind of updates is it going to have? Whereas a 10-year-old in 1912, actually, something like the Marconi, which on the Titanic, the fact that passengers could pay to have messages sent home and they're in the middle of the ocean, that's like mind-blowing in 1912. So a little 10-year-old boy would absolutely be, wanting to see that room. So I thought that was really nice for Norman. I like that.
Yeah. So it was great, and that was really new technology at the time. You could talk to another continent. It was absolutely unheard of. So the class lines are very distinctly drawn. She's lower class than her husband. They've been estranged for a while. She's taken the kids to America. She wants to give them a more simpler life. She thinks the daughter's lost cause, but the son, and he has tracked them down. He gets on board at Paris. Cherbourg, he gets on board, but you gather they've come from Paris. He gets told, and this gets right on my nerves because it was barely half full, the Titanic. But the guy's like, no, you can't get on the Titanic, sir. It's fully booked. I was like, oh. But he gets a ticket off, I can't remember this, Spanish or something like that. I can't remember. Off a family.
And it takes no convincing. He just, Clifton Webb walks up to this random man and his wife, that they're carrying like a box of grapes, and they're like, we're going to plant this and make an orchard, and we're going to make wine and it'll be great. And they're so excited. And all Clifton Webb has to do is like mention some money, like, hey, you could make a lot of money, but I could give you more. And like that, the husband's just like, bye, America. Guess we're going to stay here because this stranger has just offered to buy my ticket. Like, it took no convincing at all for this
True,
family to
but
give up.
it's a minor inconvenience to the guy. The guy gets a lot of money. They can buy an even bigger land when they get there. The wife and the daughters and kids or whatever are still going to go. And he's like, oh, well, I'll get a later ticket. Then I'll still have all this money left over. But the whole upshot of this is he's quite unpleasant at the beginning. Clifton Webb's character. He's quite unpleasant. He says something to them that I was like, oh, that's, and I'm not easily kind of bothered by stuff. But he says something like, what does he say? Oh, yeah. Just go over there into your native huddle. I think he says to them, doesn't he? Something like you go over there and like decide in whatever you speak. It's essentially what he's saying, and you're like, oh, that's a bit rough.
He's not a very
it's not pleasant.
man.
No.
Even when the man says, well, sir, we've been fully booked since March, Cliff Webb's like, well, that's great for you, but it is like, it's funny, but he's just rude. He's just a jerk. Yeah.
But I mean, that's probably you gather from later on in the film, because this really isn't a film about Titanic. Ironically, this is a film about, it's about characters, about an estranged family. You could have set this in a manor house in England somewhere, and it would have still been good. It just probably wouldn't.
My last note for this totally was my very last note was the fact it's set on Titanic feels so secondary and inconsequential. And I said to my partner, actually, I was like, the people that die in this film, you could have them die in a bus crash, and it would be the exact same. It didn't have to be on the Titanic,
It's true. I mean, there have been films. I don't know if you haven't seen it, track it. It's not easy to find, but it's called, is it The Last Voyage? Have you ever seen that?
No.
Is it The Last Voyage of the Yeah, it's The Last Voyage. And basically it's the Titanic story, but they didn't make it about a Titanic. They made it about something else, and they made it kind of more souped up in terms of, it's old. It's like 1960, I think. It's 1960. It's called The Last Voyage. It's quite hard to get hold of over here. I think it's easy in America, but it's quite decent. So there has been films that have been done that have been the Titanic in all but name. But yeah, it is kind of inconsequential that they're on the Titanic. It just brings things to a head. Because I'd forgotten how much it was about them. And we go back to what we said at the beginning about the other characters on the Titanic are inconsequential. Yeah, because it doesn't matter about them because we're following this family. And so she says about Norman, she says the young kid, she's like, he's going to walk to school, not get a lot of ponies and a carriage to take him. And she's not being like, she's not trying to be funny. You gather that that's how he's getting to school or whatever. She's like, I don't want this for him. She sees what the daughter's become like, but to be fair for the daughter, she meets this cheeky chappy American tennis player and he starts to break down those barriers. That was quite nice, to be fair. But she wants to get their feet on the ground, doesn't she? She's like, I want to, try and get them a bit more grounded. We're going to go to the new world, go to America, back home for her as well. Because you gather the dad's being quite distant. Like, he's a good dad to them, but he's been quite distant. He travels around, and we've lived out of hotels. And he's like, well, they were very nice hotels, which I just thought was such a funny argument. Like, we've been living in hotels. Yeah, but they were nice hotels.
It was an interesting dynamic because it would have been so easy for them to make Richard unlikable. And okay, he kind of was, but he was like funny. So although he was saying things that were rude and arrogant, it was almost like pantomime-esque. Like you could laugh at it. It wasn't too abhorrent, to the point where it made him irredeemable. Because if they'd done that, then you wouldn't care later on when what happens. Yeah. So when he arrives at dinner and he walks up to the table, the kids are really happy to see him. And the only person that's not happy to see him is Julia. So, like you say, he is clearly a good dad to them. And then he kind of stops being a good dad to one of them. And then he starts being a good dad when it's too late. So I actually it's an interesting...
I'm just thinking to help you out a little bit. I've got a point which explains how he gets away with being like he is, apart from the fact he's got money. There's a scene just after he gets on board the ship and he bumps into all the maids and she's like, oh, I was on the RMS, whatever. You probably don't remember me. And he goes, oh, yes, I do. You have a daughter. She plays piano, something like that. And she's like, oh, thank you for remembering. She's like a stewardess or a maid, and off she goes. And you see how charming he is. And he's naturally very charming, and he's not too bad on the eye for the ladies either. So you're thinking, right. yeah, you can understand why he is as he is, and especially when he walks around the tables and he's saying to people, "Oh, hello, Mr. Salto," and he's saying hello to, "We'll play that game," and he's a, I hate to use the cliche, but he's a smooth operator, isn't he? You can see this is a guy who's, quite charming and disarms people, but he is quite unpleasant at the beginning, like not irredeemably so, but
Yeah.
he is a little bit. So yeah, so the upshot is there's a brilliant scene where she tells him, he's not your son. And I'd forgotten. I literally gasped. I was like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that at all, because it's been so prim and proper. And I actually, for anybody listening, I messaged Arron partway through before we'd started this, saying this film's so prim and proper. Like, I'm going to sound so common talking about it, because it's so like upper class at the beginning. I'm thinking, how am I going to talk about this? But yeah,
one of the lines from the film, because it was just, I couldn't stop. I had to pause it and just laugh, because it was just so brilliantly delivered from Clifton Webb. So, he's trying to get his kids back. She's essentially kidnapping them. She doesn't want them to grow up with their dad because she's worried what they're going to become. And, we're saying that Annette is a lost cause because she's like, Annette wants to be like her dad. And that could be why she's attracted to Robert Wagner's character, because he is essentially like a young version of her dad. He's charming and he can walk up to people and just chat to people, that might be why she likes him. But so Julia, Barbara Stanwyck's character says, I'll be as common as you think I am. I'll take you to the courts and I'll fight you all the way. But their bedroom, the cabin doors open because they're just at dinner. So Clifton Webb just casually closes the door and says, "Could you be common in a slightly lower voice?" I could not stop laughing. Next time I go to my local Asda, I'm going to use that, because it will come in handy. I'm just going to start firing that at people. I just thought that was such a funny line and delivered so well. Excellent. Top tier.
Yeah, it was brilliant. But it's that kind of thing. And this film has examples of, and this is probably why it won the Academy Award for the screenplay, because it's so beautifully written at times that it can tell you so much about what the characters are doing without by showing you something. It doesn't have to. Yeah. So I think a problem modern films have is that they tell, they don't show. They tell you this character is the bestest fighter in the world. I know bestest isn't the word, but the bestest ever fighter in the world. And you go, right, but we haven't seen them do that. And then you just expected to accept it. And this film, what happens in this is there's a brilliant bit after she's told him this, and she's out on the deck and she's looking at the sea, and he comes out to talk to her, or is it, wherever it is, and she drops like the bag she's carrying. Now, even out of the niceties or the civilities of today, you'd probably pick it up for her, whether you're a man or a woman. But she looks at him because she's in a dress, and it probably is not easy for her to get down either, and a big fur coat. And she looks at him, and he just looks back at her. And there's so much said in that's kind of like, yeah, I know you want me to pick it up, but I'm not picking it up for you. And she eventually just picks it up, and you can see like he's lost all respect for her. Like they've been estranged, and you've gathered there's still love there, but after she drops this bombshell on him, he's like, no, I've got nothing left for you. And
that's so funny to bring up that specific, because right after could you be common in a slightly lower voice, I wrote that exact, like the whole scene, I just wrote all of that, and exactly what you've just said, I wrote show, don't tell.
Yeah.
Because it does, and it's like, it's instinctual for her. She's used to, she doesn't, and they both play it so well, because it would have been easy for her to look pompous. She goes to fix her coat and she drops it by accident. It's not on purpose. And her face, she just has, it's almost blank, she just, because it's instinctual, a man is near you, a man's going to pick something up for you. And his face, he's not being evil or nasty. They're both just kind of blank, because she instinctually just would expect someone to pick it up for her. And I think he just doesn't want to. He's not doing it to be bad. He just is like, no. And they both just play it so realistically, actually. And I think when people think of films from the 50s, yeah, they can be a bit campy and a bit over the top and a bit pantomime. But that little moment, I was like really taken aback by it. I was like, that's fantastic. And you're right. I seem like that, you might see it in a film nowadays, but filmmaking has gotten so lazy.
Oh God, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think the problem with and exactly what you're saying in that the films, like my dad loves cowboy films. He loves, and I don't mean like the Clint Eastwood's. I mean way back when, I mean like Shenandoah and films like that. The films that there was no special effects, there was no computer effects, the editing and everything was, filmmaking was quite not primitive, but compared to today, it was. There was nothing to hide behind for an actor. There was no explosions. There was no fast cutting. It was just you there on screen talking to somebody. And if you couldn't act, you were out the door. And I think that shows. It reminds me of the kind of film, and I know this is another cliche, but they don't make films like this anymore. Like, can you imagine if this was, pick any of the, the best actors of today, who are in the biggest blockbusters and the leading ladies who are in the biggest blockbusters and put them in a room and go, we want you to have a scene like this. It wouldn't be half as good, personally. But I mean, I don't know if you agree on that.
Because it's the underacting of it. There was like almost no acting. It was just, they just both stood there. And I actually had to rewind it because I was a bit confused because I looked down for a second to write something. And then I heard this big bang. And I looked up and I was like, what the hell just happened? So I put it back. And then I was, it was a parse, okay. And then I'm just looking at them both. And it was almost awkward because it goes on for quite a bit. They prolong a little bit. And I was just, I didn't expect. And there was only one other scene, I think, that I actually rebound because I was so taken aback by it. But we'll get onto that a bit later. But yeah, I was really surprised by it. It was fantastic, really good.
Yeah, and also it has like really good side characters. So you get so yeah, he won't pick up a bag, and he gets back and he's angry, and he basically says to her, "I won't have anything to do with him. I'm taking my daughter. You can take him to America. I'm done. He's not mine. I've got no responsibility towards him." Which, as awful as it sounds, is kind of maybe how it would have been done. I'm not massive on the civilities of then, but it probably would have been acceptable for him to do that. As nasty as it comes across. Well, it's not nasty. It's just cold, and you can tell he's deeply, deeply wounded by it. And there's a scene.
Even nowadays, it's a different vibe. But you think of these really trashy, like Jeremy Kyle or Jerry Springer, where there'd be like a DNA test, and it's like, you are not the father, and that's Maury Povich. That was, the famous one. But and these guys, even if they've raised these kids, all of a sudden they're like, no, he's not mine, so don't care. And so it probably would have been a bit of a faux pas back then to do such a thing. But actually, it would have been more of a faux pas for her to have not told him, for her to have even done that, So actually, you're right, but society would have been more on his side than hers in 1912.
Because from what I understand about that as well, is that a lot of, this might be a bit old. I don't know if this had gone out of British society by this point, but I certainly know in Victorian times, the business would pass to like the firstborn son or to the, so I'll give you, or to kind of like the eldest male employee. So I'll give an example of this, and it's really random, but I love the film. And it's, so have you ever seen Oliver, with Oliver, the musical, right? The bit where he goes to the undertakers, played by Leonard Rossiter, and he becomes like an apprentice, and the young lad who's in there calls him work ass and is really annoyed at him. It's because in the line of the business will go to Oliver, not to him anymore. So that's kind of how it worked. I don't know if that was still in place by this point. They don't explain that in the film. He's just annoyed at him, which is a bit odd. But I don't know if it's still like that in Edwardian times. But I do know there was still that like line of succession, and especially as it's not his son, because you pass things on to your son. I still think by this point there was still kind of, I don't know how it worked towards your daughters and things. I'm not that up with it. I tend to stick with the military side of the 20th century, but I think did that make sense? I hope it did.
No, yeah, totally. And I think it just shows his pride as a person. He clearly is a very proud person, and I mean, for anyone it'd be a shock, and he redeems himself later in the film, but it's quite shocking actually, because you're shown as an audience member how close him and his son Norman are.
Yeah.
You know, there's games on the deck that they take part in, and you know, he's always got his arm around him, and he clearly loves his son, and his son loves him. So for him to then so quickly just want to detach and want nothing to do with him is really, you know, it's really harsh. And when you see it, you know, take place, when Norman is at the receiving end of a father who suddenly doesn't want anything to do with him, and Norman doesn't understand the context of that, it's really sad to see, actually.
Yeah, and she says that to him, doesn't she? She says, look, don't tell, he's too young to be like smacked in the face like this. And she doesn't mean it literally, she means it figuratively. She's like, he's too young for slapping in the face like this. He doesn't understand. And he's like, well, make him understand. And she's like, really? Like, we can't, you know, we can't do this to him. He doesn't understand. But obviously, I've got the kid's 10. This isn't like an 18-month-old baby that you kind of go, oh, by the way, the kid's 10. Like, this is a long time, you know. And also from like her point of view, she doesn't like callously spit it at him in anger. She just says it to him, and it's like, oh, is like, are you using this to try and get him to kind of walk away and let you do what you want to do, which is to take your kids to America?
It's
because
almost like a last resort, like she's had it up her sleeve for this moment.
Well,
you know,
he says that to her. He says that to her, doesn't he? He says something like, "You've got, you know, you've got an ace up your, you know, you've got an ace up your sleeve," because he plays cards, and he says, you've clearly got an ace up your sleeve, so play it. Oh, boy, does she play it! She really plays it right to his face. And then you see the impact on him, because the maid that he was really friendly with earlier, he's like, she says, "Oh, hello, Mr. Strauss," and he just walks past her and ignores her. You see, she's shocked. And yeah, and about the side characters, you get Reverend George S. Healy, and we know that because you see it embossed on his Bible. So he's been a priest who's been is it called defrocked? Like, he's been kicked out, dismissed. And he's going back home, and he telegrams his family to say, "I'm going to go back home," and we see that telegram later on. And
there's a tiny little scene just after the whole, you know, dropping the bag scene. There's a little scene between him and Julia, and I was really captivated by the visual effects in that. So you've got the water, you know, they're moving through the water, you've got the starry sky, but it's, you know, there's little faint clouds still there, and it looks pretty convincing. You know, if you like half shut your eyes, you would think that they were actually on a ship, you know, moving through a kind of, you know, starry night. I just looked at that little scene and thought, that is really well done. Really, really well done.
Yeah, it was. It was that good I didn't notice. So there you go. I was just, and the performance is brilliant. So this priest, well, this ex-priest, do you ever stop becoming a priest? He's drunk. He like half collapses like onto the railings, and she helps pick him up. And he says, you know, "I'm always two things, drunk and helpful." And she's like, "Well, I don't need any help," which I laughed at. So that was such a good line. She's like, "I don't need any help." And then he says, you know, we see later on, she helps him back to his cabin. She's like, "I'll call the ship's doctor." He's like, no, I just, you know. So she's looking for some liver salt or something for him to drink before he goes to sleep. And he says, you know, "It started off with a little bit of Hennessy to help me through the day." Hennessy, for anybody, is it a Scotch or a whiskey? I can't remember.
I think it's a whiskey, but I could be wrong.
I don't want to be presuming, asking yourself, but I wasn't sure. I thought you might know. So and he talks about how dealing with all the sadness of people's lives has affected him as a priest, and he needed a crutch, a comfort, something to help him. And unfortunately, the crutch became a little glass of Hennessy. There's nothing wrong with that, you know. And he makes a bit of a joke about his parishioners saying, "Oh, you know, not Hennessy, geez, no, it might have been called that. Father Healy, sorry. You know, he's just having a Hennessy. He must have a bad cold." He's like, "Well, I ended up having a lot of colds, and this was in June," and it's quite amusing, but it's such one of those scenes where you think that there's no like reason for it. Like, in terms of, if you had to, when you were editing a film now, you'd be like, right, what does this scene actually achieve? Because it doesn't really show her as particularly comforting. It doesn't advance the plot, but it just fleshes out the world and shows like how he's fallen on hard times. Now I love that. I love that scene. Like, this is what I mean. Like, this film is probably, and yeah, I will stand by this statement. I think it's probably the best written Titanic film I've ever seen, and I certainly wasn't expecting to say that when I started watching it. It is.
That's a point, actually. I've not thought about that, but I think you might be right. I think you might be right with that.
I mean, also, I meant to say earlier when you were talking about the way that it's filmed, that the Titanic's inconsequential. This plays almost like a stage show. So you could put this alongside like an Inspector Calls or Woman in Black in terms of it. It feels like it could have been made to be put on a stage, because it could be very easily. You could do it very easily. Obviously, the latter part of it you couldn't, but the beginning parts you certainly could, because it's played very much like a stage show, and it's all about the characters. And yeah, I thought it was great. So what happens after that? Oh yeah, he refuses the match with his son, doesn't he? So
yeah, it's really sad. It was really funny just when you said, what happens after that. I'm not entirely sure what the scene was, but my next note was they turned Captain Smith into a total dish. Hello.
But did you notice? I mean, whatever float your boat, but oh god, that I didn't mean it like that. I did not mean it like that.
Whatever sinks your boat.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. On the flip side of it, though, they made him really young and dashing, and then they made Officer Murdoch. He looked about 50. And I was like, he's meant to be like, he was like 39.
I know. It's really weird. It was just so I don't know what scene it was exactly, but I just looked and was like, is that meant to be Captain Smith? Like, and we'd already seen him, but it was just this particular, I don't know if it was the lighting or the camera angle. I was like, why are they trying to make him like a sex symbol? Like, that's random.
And he was like that's a bold move, isn't it? That's a really bold move. Yeah. And because there's that scene where he sat down and he's kind of humming away, and that's another thing. And also what begins to happen, we meet this American Gifford, and he makes a point about his name. He says, well, my mother was always going to call one of us Gifford, and unfortunately it was me. So he's an American. He's at Purdue or something like that, a university over there. And he goes and meets the mother, and you see the class difference. He's very much, because Americans they say they're classless, which you stick with that, fair enough. They're not, but fair enough. And he's very much like, look, he's on her level, and he talks to her, and she just sees right through him, and he's like, oh, name's Annette, blah, blah. And they get to have this relationship, and he's breaking down these barriers with her. And the film becomes like very musical. And I love that shot where Giff, he like dances with her on the deck, and there's people watching, and she's like, bye boys, and she walks off, and he's like so happy, he like throws his cap into the sea in joy, and it floats past like these like little chunks of ice, and I thought, I love the little switch of, oh yeah, this really nice scene, but you know what's coming, and I like that. But I did read a review saying that people didn't like that scene, that it was a little bit I can't remember what the song is. I think it's like it's like a Native American song, isn't it? Is it something about, I don't think I wrote it down. Did you write it down?
No, but what I did write down was Robert Wagner's little dance and sing-song number made me want to jump overboard. When he randomly threw his hat into the sea, I was extremely jealous of the hat.
Fair enough.
I was like sitting there, and it was all good, all fine. And I like musicals. I actually do like musicals. But then all of a sudden, he just started singing and dancing, and I was like, "What's going on?" And then the people on top of like the officers' quarters or whatever started like clapping and playing a harmonica, and he just went on and on. And I was sitting there like, "Okay, that was a choice." And then so it was just really funny hearing, because I was curious to hear what your take on, because there's quite a few singing sections in this film, which I was really surprised by.
I really enjoyed this. So I've written down it's a couple of points later than this, but it's also because I think in a few scenes, we'll come back to the scene, but in a few scenes you see Captain Smith, and he's having his pipe and smoking away, and just all sexy with the smoke on his head, and he's watching again like these people on this stage singing, and he's like serenading her again, gets a bit of a kiss, and I literally wrote down in my notes, very musical, this film. it's the only Titanic film, but this is what I thought. You could have made it a musical, but number two, I also thought it's the only film I've seen of Titanic where it captured that joy of the voyage in the first 4 days. Like, this was a ship that was taking people. The majority, because it was a steerage ship. It wasn't for the millionaires. It was just a status to them. And the officers, it was a job, and the crew, 900 of them. All the other people, like the second or third class passengers, that it was a new life. It was a new start. That was why these ships were running. It wasn't a holiday to America. It was starting a new life. And I think it was meant to show kind of that joy, and also maybe kind of showing her getting a little bit more of life. You gather she'd been very, and her mum said, mum. Why did I say mum? Her mother says this about her, that she's a bit of a waste and whatever, that she's very prim and proper, and she is, because at the beginning when he first approaches her gift, she says to him, "Shouldn't you be in school somewhere?" And that made me laugh as well. That's the first line her character gets. But yeah, I quite enjoyed it, to be fair. But I mean, maybe see, I like that kind of music, so I was brought up on like Laurel and Hardy, Way Out West, and so I like that kind of music. So at no point did I feel awkward. I really quite enjoyed it, but maybe you got to be in the mood for it.
Yeah, that's really funny, the different, like, the taste that people have, because just every time it went into like kind of song mode.
No, I've got no taste. I've got no taste. Just clearly.
But like, I actually posted to my Instagram story, I was like, they're at it again. Like, they're singing again. And then it hit the iceberg, and I was like, okay, cool. But then even straight after they hit the iceberg, they're singing again.
Oh yeah.
I was like, what? They don't stop. But actually you're right, because the contrast of this really jovial singing and this, fun, upbeat singing contrasted with when they sing Nearer My God to Thee, which, in real life, they didn't all stand and sing in like a choir, but that's irrelevant, because the poignancy of that and that contrast between them singing around a piano and then all of a sudden they're all now standing on the deck singing is actually really moving and really touching. And it does kind of highlight the fact that up until that point, everyone on the ship would have been in such high spirits, even if there's all this, which there was, these real dramas and, people have real lives, all that's going on. But the overall vibe of the ship would have been really upbeat and not optimistic. And I think they captured really well the fact that it felt like a fully functioning and operational like world, because you cut to the Marconi room and they're taking in messages from people and they're talking about, hey, this guy's got a full train reserved for himself when he reaches New York. Like, that must be great. And then it goes to like the purser's office and they're talking about things there. So I think they do a really good job of fleshing out the ship and making it feel like a place where people worked, where it was their job. And, they were on that ship just doing their job. And then this awful thing happened, which even in the film feels inconsequential. But yeah, you're right. I think they did a really good job making the days leading up to that feel really positive. And yeah, I think they did a good job of making it seem like a real world with like real people.
Yeah, I tell you what as well, James Cameron definitely watched this film, because there's a scene in it where Clifton Webb's character, well, what, if you've seen this in A Night to Remember, Cameron watched them all and homaged them, if you will, because he says, why is it the British announce dinner like a cavalry charge? Oh, yeah, it's a good point. And then so he refuses a match with his son, and Lightoller, this is the only bit that I thought was got on my nerves a little bit, where they showed Lightoller kind of going around checking on these ice messages. Did this come in end? I was like, this is not, number one, I don't think it's accurate from my readings, and I've done a lot of reading, as no doubt yourself you will have done about Titanic. It just seemed a bit kind of, I thought, why are you putting this in now? Like, there's no reason for it. You could have just took those out and it would not have affected the film. Because Lightoller's not a main character in this, really. And I thought, well, why are you having him walking around saying, Captain this? And then he goes off and asks the captain about the speed. And I thought, there's no way that would be done. If a captain ordered a speed, you wouldn't go and question him on it.
They almost make Captain Smith seem like a bit of a sociopath. Like, it just seems like every officer's like, Captain, we're going really fast. Like, we do have ice warnings. And Captain Smith's like, nonsense, don't worry about it, it's fine. Like, we'll just crank up the speed some more. Like, they did make Captain Smith seem like a bit of a psycho. Like, intentionally or not, I don't know. But
a sexy psycho.
taxi cycle,
No,
bit of a Ted
well,
Bundy captain.
I think what they were trying to do, I think they were trying to kind of create this impending doom, whereas it was like, well, we know it's the Titanic, you don't need to do that. And it would be more realistic if that didn't happen. Like there's a line, the only line that I thought, oh, that's a bit of a clunker, where they say something like, oh, is this the same iceberg? And Lightoll's got the two pieces of paper with the guy who's charting the route. And the guy's like, and Lightoll's like, yeah, but what if they're not the same one? And he turns around like, anybody, guys? And there's no one there. And I'm like, oh, it went a little bit. I thought that was the only bit that I was like, yeah, you don't need to do that. And with Captain Smith, I think they were trying to make the point of, is he being a bit reckless? But it's a bit unfair because the kind of standard thinking at the time, Andy plotted the route further south than he was supposed to, and they kind of make that point as well. Was that you would get through an ice field as quickly as you could, because staying in it did you no good. You either got stopped for the night and you got stuck like the Californian did, or you put your speed on and you got out of it as quick as possible. Because to stay in that area with the icebergs wasn't a good idea. You've got more chance of being hit, so get yourself out of it. And the ship wasn't by any means going at its top speed. It was going quick, but it wasn't. I don't think all the boilers were lit. I can't remember. It's been a while, but I'm pretty sure.
It's one of the things, when I was saying in the beginning, trying to combat those common misconceptions and this idea of Ismay wanting to be the fastest, and they'd already done that. The White Star Line had already made the fastest crossing with Olympic, so there was no great urge to do it again because they'd already done it. They had beaten Cunard, and that was kind of box ticked. Like they weren't actually actively trying to be, and this blue ribbon thing didn't exist. There was no medal waiting for them when they got to New York. Ismay being overheard by a first-class female passenger whose name I forget.
Mrs. Emily Ryerson.
Well, was it Emily Ryerson that also? Her accounts are just incredible. Like her memory, the vividness of them. She's a very.
Oh, was it? Hang on a minute. I might be confusing Mrs. Emily Ryerson. I tell a lie. I might. Oh no! It was because she's in Titanic Untold Stories. I've reviewed that documentary on my podcast, and she was going to America to. I think her son had been killed in a car crash. She was going to claim his body, and it was one of the only times she went out of her cabin, and she sat and heard Ismay talking to Smith about this.
So it's just really, this idea of trying to be fast, but also, they're being reckless because actually Smith had gone further south in order to avoid ice. So it wasn't like he knew that there was ice right in front of them and he just kept upping the speed. Like it was a bit of both, he knew there was ice ahead of them. So he moved out of the way of the ice, or he thought he did, enough. And they were also like incrementally upping the speed because they could, because they were like, if we can get in a bit earlier, why not? Like, it's a new ship, might as well like stretch your legs kind of thing. But they weren't like doing it to their knowledge into the path of ice. They thought that they had avoided it. So I can see why, this film decided to have Smith come across as a bit reckless. But yes, it's a shame because, the man had only been dead for like 41 years and he's already being portrayed as careless. And by all accounts, all true accounts, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, it was an interesting choice that we make, I think. And also the way that he'd got out of various scripts before. I think he'd been commanding the Olympic when it hit the HMS Hawk. So he'd been in situations where the ships had been damaged. And there's certainly, and this is probably isn't uncommon of most people at the time, he certainly had a misplaced sense of the ship's design and how practically unsinkable it was. Because apparently he sat one night on a table and he said if the ship was like this and you cut it into sections, each section would float. So he certainly had an idea that it was much more structurally sound than it was. And also the idea at the time was where anything big enough to sink us, we're going to see in time to turn away from. And then there's the argument about Murdoch. He's not 50 odd. He was only 39, I think, a young man really. And he ran the engines full astern, which they think hindered its turning circle even more, even though it wasn't a very good turning circle. If they'd kept the engines going forward, and then the propellers going that way and turned it, they might have got out of the way of it. But it's all conjecture. I mean, we don't know how big the iceberg was underneath. It could have been huge. You know, so
actually, evidence to kind of suggest that it wasn't just kind of side-on damage. There was evidence, or you know, there's been kind of calculations done since then to suggest that actually the iceberg might have scraped the bottom of the ship. So even if they had gotten away enough to not have any side-on damage, the iceberg might have still scraped the bottom. So it's one of these things, you know, you're right, we can theorize about it till we're blue in the face, but you know, we weren't there, you know. And when you're faced with that kind of last minute kind of split second decision, you know, shoulda, woulda, coulda. But
I mean, as for Murdoch being the one in charge when the ship hit the iceberg, he's credited with saving more people than any other officer. So you got Lightoller in the films come across as a hero, but actually he let less people in his boats because he stuck vehemently to to women and children, no men. Whereas Murdoch put women and children in his boats and then went, right, anyone else, men, get in, anybody get in, like, I need to get you need to get away. And unfortunately, in the way he's being portrayed in the films, particularly Cameron's, which, if anything, I don't agree with editing films down after they've been released, but I think that would have been, I'd have agreed with that one. Because I think, I mean, there are vague reports of shooting towards the end, but by that point, the people who would have been on the ship would have all died, so there's no kind of witnesses. You know, it's even like Nearer My God to Thee. Harold Bride was one of the latest people, you know, the last people off the ship to live, along with Lightoller. He said when he came out of his cabin, it was autumn that he heard, which sounds similar to Near My God to Thee. So there's even arguments for something, but there's even debates about that. Nothing's set in stone. Problem with Titanic is that everybody thinks, lay people think, oh, everything's been discovered, everything's known. Well, it isn't really. It's only like a few years ago, they thought the rockets were all white, whereas they found the actual rockets on the seabed, and it turned out they're all different colors, which then gives it gives a different view on the Californian, because they reported they didn't see colored rockets. So was it the Titanic they saw? So things change all the time. So yeah,
that's what I think is really fascinating about it all. Is all these little things that come out that you think everything's settled. Like even something as simple as, well, if they'd had more lifeboats, everyone would have lived. It's like, but you're ignoring the fact that they didn't even manage to successfully launch every single, like the collapsible boats floated off the boat deck. One of them was found floating around full of water with dead bodies and stuff. Like, so if they had, was it 18?
They had 16 boats and 4 collapsibles.
That's it. So say they had like 50 lifeboats or something.
They didn't start launching the boats, and the films always miss this out. They didn't start they hit the iceberg at 20 to 12 at midnight. They didn't start launching the boats till 20 to 1. So they didn't start launching the boats for an hour. And then by the time they launched them, none of the crew had any training. None of them. They didn't all speak the same language. Neither did the passengers. There was no tannoy system. There was certainly no alarm like this film shows, which was getting right on my wick. In the background, like a submarine film. It was like, I was expecting to hear like, oh God. It was like a dive, wasn't it? So, it's this thing of, there could have been 48 lifeboats on the ship, but they wouldn't have saved everybody because they barely got the ones off. And this ship is very unusual. The Titanic, the way it sank, most ships capsized. If you look at any other ship that sank, a warship or anything like that sank, been damaged, they tend to turn over. The Titanic didn't turn over, so they don't even know if the carpenters and the crew were actually trimming the ship as it sank to keep it upright, which allowed them to get, all the boats down. Like the Costa Concordia, to go back to that, they couldn't use half their lifeboats because they were on the side of the ship that once it's past a certain angle, you can't scrape a boat down the side of the ship. So
there was a lot of factors. They were lucky that they were sinking pretty straight down by the head. But I give this film a lot of credit because it's the first and one of the only, to be honest, films to show the port list. So, the ship leaning to its left side You know, if you're standing on the bow, leaning to its left side quite heavily, which I think in real life it had a 10-degree list to port. None of the, and I don't know if it's intentional, you know, maybe they started sinking the model and it was just tilting and, you know, whatever, but it looks good. It looks really good. And it probably is intentional, because when you cut back onto the ship and you see Norman, you know, he's jumped back on to the ship to look for his dad. There is a port list, you know, they're walking, you know, quite funny because the ship is really leaning onto its side. And I mentioned earlier, I alluded to that there were two scenes that gave me pause and actually really quite like affected me in like good ways, because they were not what I expected from this film. And one of them was obviously the scene where they dropped the purse, because it was just really underplayed and really realistic, and I really appreciated that. And the other scene was when Julia realizes that Norman isn't in the lifeboat anymore, and she screams Norman's name. You know, they've reached the water, they're in the lifeboat. She realizes her 10-year-old son is back on the ship looking for his dad, and she just wails his name up to the ship. And the way that Barbara Stanwyck does it is so, like, I got shivers down my spine, like, and I played it again and I got shivers again. Like, she does it so well. It's like this like primal scream of a mother, like, that knows that her son, like, she's lost him, like, he's gone. I think Barbara played that superbly, so good.
Yeah, it was horrendous. So the bit about the list, so they reckon it listed that way because they had, funny enough, Tony's, they had Scotland Road that ran up that side of the ship, which was, for people who've seen the 1997 film, it's the long stretch that Jack and Rose run towards each other. That's Scotland Road. It's like the longest kind of, I think it was the least, like, there was no doors in it, so they reckon it flooded on that way and tilted slightly because it took longer on the other side to flood. These are the theories. I don't think we'll ever really know. The warning sirens fictional, which is a tad off-putting. I wrote down, did my upset heading.
The whole time, it's like all of a sudden it's become like a World War II film. It's like an air siren. It's like, what the hell's going on? It was like what happens. It was like a call to quarters. They go off in like Royal Navy ships and things where you see them on the war films where they call everyone to their action stations, but it goes on and on and on. And some scenes it's really prominent, and other scenes it's like in the background. And because I was watching it thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be hearing this while I sleep. You know, it was just in the background all the way through. And I remember I was like, the panic, and to be fair, the sinking sequence, for anyone that wants to, you know, rent or buy this film to watch it just for the sinking, I wouldn't actually recommend that, because the sinking scenes, it's quite a small part of the film. You know, the character drama and the character dynamics are the film. You know, the sinking sequence is fairly short, and actually the ship is stuck in like the one sinking position for most of the sinking. You know, with the bow kind of slightly underwater and with this really prominent port list and the propellers just out the water. That's really mostly what you see. But the siren, it goes on for the whole time. And I remember thinking, you know, straight away, it seems like people are really panicking, and, you know, they're rushing up the grand staircase to get to the lifeboats, and, you know, they're kind of shoving each other to get to the boats. And I'm like, well, no wonder. If you've got a siren like that going off, people are going to panic. So you wouldn't actually, the band wouldn't be playing, you know, because in real life, the band played to keep people calm, and that was the point. But in this scenario where there's like this warning siren going off, there'd be no point having the band play, because that siren's just going to wash everything else out.
Yeah, it was a strange choice. I think it was one of the only times where they made it more cinematic than it needed to. It wasn't needed. So Giff says goodbye to Annette. Cliff then went again, another great line. He says, and this is one of those lines that could have been so badly cheesy, but the way he plays it's brilliant. He says to somebody, because he realizes this shows his redemption as a character, he puts his family on a boat before Norma jumps off. Little scamp. He realizes he's going to have to, he realizes, oh God, I've got something. He rushes down for the family of the bloke he's bought the ticket off, because he thinks I need to save them as well. And he goes and gets them. And as he's going, this one of the old fellas, the the old fellas who's first class with him says, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he says, "We need to go and get this family. I've got stuff to take care of." And the guy says something like, "Are you sure it's that serious?" And he's like, we may be eating sand for supper." I thought that was quite. See, I'm from the north. We don't say so. Well, we do say something, but not in the way they mean it.
Yeah.
So it was like, oh, okay, yeah, fair enough. And then, but the Gift says goodbye to Annette, which was a really good scene. And also, I mean, the scene between Clifton and Barbara is just an example of outstanding acting, where they stood there on the boat deck of this ship, and they're basically saying to each other, where's the last 20 years gone? What happened to the love, really? Like, you still see they love each other, but like they're both like, what the hell happened? And they realize it's the end. She realizes, she says, "Oh, thanks for lying to me." And he's like, "Well, it makes it easy for me as well." He knows what, and all the guys do on the ship, really, that they realize. He manages to save the other family. But that scene where like they're looking at each other, and that was pretty, because for anybody, regardless of who you're with, the idea that you'd ever be in a situation where you would have to you'd have to put your family on a boat or help them safe and then step back and accept that it's pretty much the end for you. Absolutely horrendous. I don't want to imagine it, but that was the scene that affected me a little bit. I messaged yourself saying this film's a bit strong. That was the only bit where I was like, "Oof, this is a bit much."
It started getting like really intense, which is good, because like I say, it contrasts with the kind of light-hearted, humorous section of the kind of first half, or first like 2/3. And then even in the lifeboat, when someone hands Julia, I'm assuming it's Norman's gloves.
Yeah.
I think they find his gloves in the back of the boat, and they're like, "Hey, let's hand them to the mother who's grieving her soon-to-be son. That's a good idea." So they pass it on the boat, like, "Hey, pass it on." And then she's like, "Ah," she's distraught. It's like, why did you do that? That's horrible. Like, but yeah, amazing acting. Like, for again, an actress who would have been trained in like cinema's like super primitive age, probably before like films were even had like speech and audio, when they were first referred to as like talkies. Her acting is really good. Like, she's a very convincing actress. She doesn't like play it up, it's not hammy. So it's fantastic. She's really good in the role. And it's a good study. It's a really good character study. You don't need to focus on the historical characters. Like we've said, the Titanic thing's kind of secondary. It's kind of just looking at two people or a family and saying, they're going through this at the moment, but how would they react if this happened? And it's a really good, and you're right, it could be a play. It'd be a fantastic play, actually. I do act myself, and if I ever saw that this was like a play, I'd like beg.
You want to be Captain Smith, don't you? I know what you want to be, Captain Smith. You grow your beard out and you'd be like, "I want to sit there with a pipe smouldering away." That's what you. I know.
It's the opposite. I would shave off and I'd be Julia. I'd be like, "I'm your Barbara Stamp."
I just thought you'd gone for the daughter, to be fair. You're too young to play the older, too young.
Nah, she's a lost cause.
Well, yeah. It depends. You might get some dashing American. You never know. Sure. Let's have a look. So Norman gets out of the lifeboat to give his space to this old lady. Now, that's based on a true incident that happened, but it wasn't a first-class kid. There was no first-class kids that... Or was there? Was the one little girl, I think. But apart from that, I think the majority survived. Giff has his kind of hero moment, puts her on the boat, steps back, and then and this is based on fact as well. I can't remember what lifeboat, but it ends up stuck over the top of another lifeboat. And this is more realistic than the James Cameron version, which even he admitted, "Oh, well, I went for action. I went for action rather than realism." This is more realistic. He hangs on the fall ropes and he's trying to untwist it. And whilst he's doing it, his hand gets caught, rope burns, he falls to the sea. And I love the fact they showed him with a head injury, because you wouldn't be able to fall that far, even when the deck was relatively stable, and be all right. It was 40 feet plus down to the ocean. It's like hitting concrete. And he gets pulled aboard like a lifeboat with the head wound, but he lives. Because you see him later on, like really struggling to row, like he's seriously got like a bad concussion. Because all the others are rowing really nicely, and he's there like trying to row, like really out of sync with everybody else. And you're like, yeah, like, Gifts played by Robert Wagner. Like I saw that and I was like waiting for him to appear. And then when I saw at the end, I was like, oh my God, that was him. I didn't even recognize him. Like Robert Wagner to me, he's like number 2 in Austin Powers. Like I've not seen him, like I didn't recognize him. But speaking of the last little moment that I love that just told you so much was the scene where just before he finds his son, he stood on the deck, Clifton's character, and he's smoking probably his last cigarette that he's got left, and a load of the men from the boiler room or the stoker room, whatever, appear, and there's this guy stood there covered in all the soot and everything, and Clifton Webb just doesn't say anything to him, just takes the cigarette out of his mouth and just passes it to this guy, and the guy like looks at him as if to say thank you. And I wrote down, class doesn't matter, like they're all in it now. And I thought that said so much, that little bit of it doesn't matter now, does man, woman, child, like highest class, lowest class, it doesn't matter now, which is completely irrelevant. Speaking of relevancy,
he's spoken about Julia being common, so he clearly does see himself as being better than people. And you're right, he now sees himself as just being a human. It's just another man who's now going to die, just like the man next to him. In terms of the last kind of few scenes with the sinking, they're very explosive. Like the one sinking scene that you can find on YouTube, which is just one small clip, is the kind of final explosion when they're singing "Nearer My God to Thee." But there's like 2 explosions even before that. Like
I gather they're meant to be the boilers exploding, but which there were reports of like explosions within the ship, but they weren't like that explosive. I think what they thought was they had this beautiful moment, they're all singing and it's horrendous, and Clifton Webb's nearly crying and I'm really crying, and you're watching it and you're thinking, oh, this is like, how's this going to finish? And then the boiler goes up, the people all hit the deck, people fall over, and then the ship just takes its final plunge. I think the reason why they put the explosions in was because they couldn't figure out a way to, like, you couldn't, because it would have been like to transition, I think. Also the technical aspect of it, but also the mood change. Like, I don't think it probably would have come across as like farcical if they'd have had them singing and then the boat slowly slipped in. I think it would have been almost like unintentionally funny, as if they were trying to be comedic with it. So I think maybe they thought, well, if you have the boilers explode, it's like, you've had this haunting moment, but that's it now. Like it's over with. But
it kind of dead. But I was thinking just before we came on, I was like, interestingly, because when you think of A Night to Remember, you've got the very visceral scene of Lightoller trying to get the collapsible boat off, and the ground under his feet slips into the water, and then all of a sudden he just dives into the water. You don't really have that with this film. The boat deck set clearly was not built in a tank. Clearly they're on a sound stage, there's no water. So the filmmakers had to think, right, how can we show that the ship is sinking? They've got the interior shots, so they've got the purser's office, they've got when the iceberg hits, there's a very cool shot of the wall tearing open and water pouring in. That's really cool. But the promenade deck and the boat deck, you never see them flood or go underwater. So the filmmakers clearly thought, how can we symbolize the ship sinking without water? So there's a few explosions, and actually it works. Fair enough. Okay. It took a while because I was watching it. I was like, why so many? Like, there's like 3 different explosions, and it's gruesome because they fall down and they're covered in like cuts, and their clothes are ripped, and they're all covered in smoke and soot. But then I thought, okay, right. So they're trying to symbolize that the ship's sinking, but they're limited because they don't have a tank.
Yeah. Well, so just before that bit as well.
That respect, it worked.
Oh yeah, I mean, just before that bit as well, to go back to the priest, like they give him an arc as well. So he's wrote down a telegram earlier saying to his family, "I've been dismissed. I'm coming home." And that telegram gets used by Captain Smith. He turns it over to write the coordinates of where the ship is. So the family never get that telegram, amongst a lot of others. They don't know he's on his way. They probably don't even know he's on the ship unfortunately. So one of the boiler explodes, and he goes to run down there, and he said, "There's people coming the other way saying, get out, it's going under, get out." And he says, "Are the men down there?" And they say, "Yeah, but they're trapped." And he says, what does he say? "For the good of God, man, don't go there." And he says, "For the good of God, I'm going." And he goes, and it explodes, and you figure he's died trying to give comfort to these. So that's like his redemption. That was like that was another moment that I thought, yeah, that's like, I wasn't expecting that either. Like, I could barely remember the film, but I thought that was quite an interesting turn of events for him. There's a character, Mr. Meeks, who ends up on the boat because he's dressed as a woman again, a hoax. There's no evidence for that. They reckon it was made up by like a newspaper guy to poke at kind of one of his rivals. There's lots of things, but fortunately we won't know because a lot of the people who would have been there aren't around really. And the bit where the Norman say, well, Richard finds Norman, and Norman says to his dad, "I'm wearing long trousers. I thought we could swim for it together." And it's like you get the sense the kid knows kind of what it means, but he kind of doesn't. And he's saying, that's enough of a man. And Clifton Webb says to like a steward and to his son, "This is my son. I've never been more prouder. I feel as tall as a mountain." And I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting it to be that like deep. I wasn't expecting it that, because of how his character's been, and that scene where you see all the men's faces and they just all look, and the kid, and they all look absolutely heartbroken. And I just thought, like, when a film's this good that I will let it off the fact of like having Titanic Southampton written on the back of it, and the fact that the iceberg bits are clearly styrofoam, and there's if like you see the iceberg hit them on the port side. No, hit them on the starboard side, and then you see the port side get like gashed. I was like, why didn't you just flip the film round? You did it right, then you did it wrong. Like, when a film's this good, and also what I keep meaning to say, I keep forgetting, is that the film, although the ship is secondary, it never feels like frivolous, like it's just set on the Titanic for the sake of it. Now, I don't know how they've pulled that off, and I don't really have an explanation for why I feel like that, but it never feels like they've just chucked it on the ship for the sake of it.
I think I give a lot of credit to this film because it's the first one to show, or well, not show, but imply that the ship broke, because it was denied. It was, people mocked survivors that said, "Oh, we watched the ship break apart," and people were like, "It didn't break." Like, and there's a lot of reasons. That's a whole different discussion. But it was only until the wreck was discovered that people were like, "Oh my god, the ship did break!" Like, wow. And the explosions, the final explosion, there's like debris flies off the ship, and you actually see the deck. It gives way under the feet of the people left on the ship, and walls break apart and windows smash. So it heavily implies that the ship broke apart, and I really appreciate that. I really respect the fact that it was the first to do that, because they didn't have to, they didn't need to imply that. But and I think it was almost respectful to those who said, I saw the ship break. Famously, I think it was Melvina Dean, but I could be wrong. But there was a survivor who was at a Titanic convention. So she's there. She was on the ship, and she's surrounded by people that are just enthusiasts of the ship. They weren't there. They just think the story's worth remembering, and that's great. But she was mocked at this convention in like the early 80s for saying that she saw the ship break. And this guy with a microphone, he snatched the microphone out of her hand.
Oh, I've seen this clip. Yeah.
And he was just like, well, no, that couldn't have happened. Like, and then a few years later, the wreck is found, and it's found in two pieces. So like, yeah, it did happen. Like, so when I watched this film, that's that one bit where the deck, it breaks apart. It's subtle, but you see it.
Yeah. Well,
and I think, I like that a lot.
There's still debate as to whether it broke at the waterline, slightly under the waterline. Where did it break? Was it in front of the second funnel, behind it, or was it third funnel? Either way, see, this is what people. There's still a lot of kind of debate about how the ship did break apart and whether it clung together. And because the fact was, by the time it broke apart, the lights had gone out. Because how they kept the lights on for so long is not unbelievable. The fact they managed to, the engineers, none of whom survived, managed to keep the lights going virtually to the end, because everything would have been, all the breakers would have been popping. That was quite kind of, there was no light, so the only people who kind of heard it or would have been able to see it were the ones who were there. Light, like, they tended to take the accounts of officers or upper class, again back to class Britain, of course. They took the accounts of the officers and the first class passengers over other people, for what, various reasons. So I think that's something that it's good that they could. I never thought of it like that, so I like that idea that maybe they thought, right, well, yeah, we'll imply that it broke apart, because clearly they wouldn't have had the technology to do it either, in terms of the model. So no, that was the end of my notes. Did you have anything else that you wanted to go through? Any more notes?
No, that was the end of my notes. Just credit for being the first Titanic film to imply that the ship broke. And my final note was one that we've already said. The fact that it's set on the Titanic just feels secondary. But I would still recommend it. I think people should still watch it, because I think it's one of those, there's a lot of Titanic media out there, and some of it should be avoided at all costs. It's bad.
Yeah, Titanic 2012, we're looking at you.
Oh my God, that's awful. Yes. Titanic, The Legend Goes On, which is an animated one where there's a rapping dog.
Is that the, yeah, oh God, no. Yeah, I've heard about that. Oh my good God, no.
And like, cartoon octopus saves the ship and puts it back together and no one dies. Like, okay, that's a choice.
I've avoided that one. That's one Titanic piece of I'm glad I haven't seen. To be honest with you, I don't want to see that one. Don't want to see it.
But I would really recommend this one, because I think the sinking scenes in particular, with the animatronic lifeboats in the foreground,
they're pretty decent.
Super decent. The ship model itself is incredible. So the far off shots of it sinking are they're really worth seeing. But I just think, as a film, like I say, this could have happened anywhere, and the people that died could have died in like a bus crash, but it would still be worth seeing, even though it wasn't about Titanic. The fact that it's about Titanic doesn't actually matter. I think what does matter is that it's a really well written and well acted film, and I would just highly recommend it to anyone that likes films, because it's a good one.
Yeah, it is a cracker. I can't say any better than that. So Arron, just before we close things out, do you want to just give yourself a bit of an introduction and just say where people can find not just your podcast, but also your art and that kind of thing? So I'll throw the floor to you.
Yeah. So on Instagram, if you look up Time To Talk Titanic, you will find the Instagram page. And my art, I'm working on a book, an illustrated history book, kind of geared towards younger learners in schools, is Titanic Artist, so Titanic_artist. So you can find me there. And thank you very much for having me on. This has been great. I've really enjoyed it.
No, so have I. I could, honest to God, talk about Titanic till the cows come home. I'm forever picking out new things, because there's that much out there about the Titanic. There's Ghosts of the Abyss I haven't done yet. There's loads of documentaries. Like, I don't really want to review loads of documentaries, but there's some good ones out there. There's just so much to go over. Like, it's just and whenever something new comes up, I will give you a bit of a tip though, if you haven't seen it. There's a series they do, it's called like Drain the Ocean, where they like computer graphically drain the ocean, and they did a Titanic one. Oh my God, there's an hour. I mean, people could say that about this podcast, and that would be fair enough, but good God, that program was an hour of my life I'll never get back. What a waste of time. Like, they didn't say anything about it. It was just like, here's the ship. If you drain the ocean, right, okay. Anything else? And I also watched one about, that was on Channel 4, Channel 5, one of those, about the, avoid the Olympic and Titanic ones, did the swap, avoid those. And also avoid this one about, was there a fire on board the ship? I'm like, well, there might have been. There was. We know there was. They've accounted it. It happened all the time. Oh, well, it might have weakened the ship. Yeah, it might have. Is that all? Is that it? Like, it wasn't wasting my time. But
there's news here. Like last year, I came across an article that was suggested, and it said, did a solar flare sink the Titanic, and I was like, I give up. I'm leaving then. Like, it's just, you know, next year it'll be like, did a grizzly bear sink the Titanic? You know, they'll just keep coming up with new, and if anything, it actually shows the evergreen nature of the Titanic disaster, that it doesn't matter what's in the thumbnail or what's in the title, people are going to click it because the Titanic, even if it's nothing to do with the film, and even if the film is what kind of made people aware of the disaster, it's almost become like biblical or like a Greek tragedy at this point. It's completely surpassed the real historical event. It's become
absolutely
so much more than that. It's like a moral fable at this point.
Out of the 3 top episodes I've got top rated, 2 of them, the second and third of Titanic. Out of just, that's it. Like it seems to transcend everything else. Doesn't matter what you talk about. My top rated episode, Spider-Man, for obvious reasons, brought it out on the day it came out in America, with spoilers. So that was why that was popular. And then the next 2 are Titanic. One's a documentary, and one was the '97 film that I talked about for an hour and 40 minutes on my own. So that those are, I don't know, it seems to be this this thing that people like love to read about and love to listen to. So hopefully they'll find this interesting. But once again, Arron, thank you for coming on. And thank you to anybody who's listened. We'll be back with some more reviews soon. Cheers, guys. Thanks, Arron.
Thank you.